Good evening. I'm bringing you extensive coverage of three interconnected stories that continue to dominate headlines and shape the national conversation, beginning with what financial analysts are now calling the most consequential bilateral trade agreement of the 21st century, the Trump-Modi deal between the United States and India, which has entered its second full day of market reaction, with Wall Street continuing to surge on what investors are interpreting as a fundamental realignment of global economic relationships that favors American strategic interests while opening enormous new opportunities for corporate expansion into one of the world's fastest-growing major economies. Trading activity this morning showed sustained momentum from yesterday's explosive rally, with the Dow Jones Industrial Average climbing another 340 points in early trading to reach levels not seen since the pre-pandemic euphoria of early 2020. The S&P 500 advancing 1.4% as buying pressure remained broad-based across sectors, and the Nasdaq Composite gaining 1.8% as technology companies with significant exposure to Indian markets or those planning expansions into India saw particularly strong investor interest, reflecting growing confidence that this trade agreement represents not just a one-time policy shift, but rather the foundation for a sustained deepening of economic integration between the world's largest democracy and the world's most powerful economy over the coming years and potentially decades. Corporate executives from major multinational companies have begun issuing statements and holding investor calls to discuss the implications of the trade deal for their businesses, with CEOs from companies in sectors ranging from automotive manufacturing to consumer electronics to pharmaceuticals to industrial equipment expressing enthusiasm about the opportunities created by tariff-free access to the Indian market for American goods and tariff-free access to the American market for Indian manufactured products. And several major corporations have already announced plans to accelerate investments in Indian manufacturing facilities or expand existing operations in India to take advantage of the new tariff structure, with one major automotive parts manufacturer announcing this morning a $2.3 billion investment in new manufacturing capacity in India that will produce components for both the Indian domestic market and for export to the United States and other markets. Indian stock markets have continued their own rally in response to the agreement, with the Bombay Stock Exchange's Sensex index climbing another 80 points overnight as Indian investors process the implications of what Prime Minister Modi is characterizing as a transformational agreement that will accelerate India's emergence as a global manufacturing powerhouse and create millions of new jobs in Indian industry over the next decade. And the Indian rupee has strengthened further against the dollar, gaining approximately 2.1% over the past two trading sessions, as currency markets anticipate increased dollar inflows to India as trade volumes expand and as foreign direct investment into Indian manufacturing accelerates in response to the improved market access conditions. Energy markets are simultaneously grappling with the implications of India's commitment to halt all Russian oil imports, a decision that is already beginning to reshape global crude oil flows even before the policy is fully implemented, with Brent crude prices climbing $3.7 per barrel to reach $87.45 on expectations that Indian demand will shift to Middle Eastern suppliers who may have less spare capacity than previously assumed, while Russian Urals crude, the benchmark for Russian oil exports, has fallen sharply to a discount of nearly $19 per barrel compared to Brent, reflecting market expectations that Russian producers will be forced to offer even steeper discounts to Chinese buyers, who will be essentially the only major market remaining for Russian crude once India completes its withdrawal from purchasing Russian oil over the next several months. Saudi Arabian officials have confirmed in statements to international media that the kingdom has already begun discussions with Indian refiners about substantially increasing crude oil shipments to India, with Saudi Energy Ministry sources indicating that Saudi Arabia could potentially increase exports to India by as much as 800,000 barrels per day within 6 months as production is ramped up and shipping logistics are optimized, though Saudi officials have also indicated that such increases would likely come at the expense of shipments to other markets or would require Saudi Arabia to increase overall production levels, potentially putting pressure on OPEC Plus agreements that have sought to manage global oil supplies to maintain price stability. The United Arab Emirates has similarly indicated interest in expanding oil exports to India, with Emirati officials announcing that the state oil company ADNOC is in advanced discussions with several Indian refining companies about long-term supply contracts that would guarantee increased volumes at stable prices. And Iraq has also emerged as a likely beneficiary of India's shift away from Russian crude, with Iraqi oil ministry officials telling Reuters that they anticipate being able to increase exports to India substantially given Iraq's proximity to Indian markets and its significant spare production capacity that could be brought online relatively quickly if demand and prices justify the investments required. American oil producers are also exploring opportunities to increase exports to India, with several major U.S. shale producers announcing that they are in discussions with Indian refiners about potential long-term supply agreements, though the economics of shipping American crude oil across the Pacific to India remain challenging given the distances involved and the competition from closer Middle Eastern suppliers. And industry analysts suggest that significant U.S. crude exports to India would likely require Indian refiners to make investments in upgrading their facilities to handle the lighter, sweeter crude that American shale formations produce, as opposed to the heavier, more sour crude from Russia and the Middle East that Indian refineries are currently configured to process. Geopolitical analysts are continuing to dissect the strategic implications of India's alignment with Western positions on Russian energy, with several prominent foreign policy experts publishing analyses arguing that this represents the most significant shift in Indian foreign policy since the end of the Cold War and potentially marks the end of India's traditional non-aligned stance in international affairs, though Indian government officials are pushing back against this characterization, insisting that India remains committed to strategic autonomy and that the decision to halt Russian oil purchases was made purely on economic grounds based on the calculation that the benefits of the U.S. trade agreement outweigh the advantages of continued access to discounted Russian crude. Russian President Vladimir Putin has not yet commented publicly on the India-U.S. trade agreement, but Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov issued a statement describing the agreement as regrettable and suggesting that Russia would re-evaluate its relationship with India in light of what he characterized as India's decision to bow to American economic pressure, though Peskov notably did not specify what concrete steps Russia might take in response, reflecting Moscow's limited leverage over New Delhi given Russia's international isolation and its need to maintain whatever partnerships it can in the face of comprehensive Western sanctions. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Mao Ning offered measured comments on the trade deal during her regular press briefing in Beijing, stating that China hopes all countries will pursue trade policies that contribute to global economic stability and that respect international trade rules, while also suggesting somewhat pointedly that countries should be wary of becoming too dependent on any single trading partner, a comment that analysts interpreted as a veiled warning to India about the risks of aligning too closely with the United States economically, though Chinese officials have been careful not to criticize the agreement too harshly, given China's own extensive trade relationship with both the United States and India, and Beijing's desire to avoid appearing to oppose mutually beneficial trade agreements between other countries. Turning now to developments in the ongoing government funding crisis, where the 6-week continuing resolution passed by the House of Representatives yesterday has now been sent to the Senate, where it is expected to pass with bipartisan support later this evening, allowing government agencies to reopen tomorrow and ending the immediate crisis while setting the stage for intensive negotiations over immigration and customs enforcement funding and border policy that will need to produce results within the next 6 weeks if another shutdown is to be avoided. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Minority Leader Mitch McConnell issued a rare joint statement this afternoon expressing their commitment to ensuring the continuing resolution passes quickly and that federal workers can return to work as soon as possible, while also acknowledging the difficult negotiations that lie ahead on immigration funding and policy, with both leaders emphasizing that compromise will be necessary from both parties if a longer-term funding agreement is to be achieved, though neither provided specifics about what such compromises might entail or how the substantial differences between Republican and Democratic positions on immigration enforcement might be bridged. The The White House has issued its own statement welcoming the continuing resolution while reiterating the administration's position that any longer-term funding agreement must include substantial increases in ICE funding and support for border security infrastructure, with Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt telling reporters during her daily briefing that President Trump views strong immigration enforcement as a non-negotiable priority and that he expects congressional Republicans to hold firm in demanding the resources necessary to secure the border and enforce immigration laws, though Leavitt also acknowledged that some degree of negotiation with Democrats will be necessary given the narrow Republican majority in the House and the need for some Democratic support in the Senate to pass any funding legislation. Progressive Democrats are already organizing to pressure their party's leadership to resist what they characterize as excessive Republican demands for immigration enforcement funding, with Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus holding a press conference this afternoon to outline their red lines for any immigration funding agreement, including absolute opposition to any increases in ICE detention capacity, demands for strict oversight of immigration enforcement activities to prevent civil rights violations, insistence on protections for Dreamers and other long-resident undocumented immigrants, and requirements that any border security funding be accompanied by equal investments in humanitarian assistance and processing capacity for asylum seekers. Immigration advocacy organizations are mobilizing their supporters to contact members of Congress and urge them to oppose what these groups describe as cruel and counterproductive enforcement-focused immigration policies, with organizations including United We Dream, the American Immigration Council, and the National Immigration Law Center coordinating campaigns to flood congressional offices with calls and emails opposing ICE funding increases and demanding comprehensive immigration reform that includes pathways to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. And several major advocacy organizations have announced plans for rallies and demonstrations in Washington and other cities to coincide with the negotiations over the coming weeks. On the other side of the debate, conservative immigration restrictionist groups are similarly mobilizing to pressure Republicans to hold firm on enforcement funding demands, with organizations including the Federation for American Immigration Reform and Numbers USA urging their members to contact representatives and senators to insist on substantial increases in immigration enforcement resources and opposition to any legalization programs for undocumented immigrants, creating a dynamic where members of Congress will be receiving intense pressure from activist constituencies on both sides of the immigration debate as they attempt to negotiate a funding agreement that can pass both chambers and be signed by the president. Federal employee unions representing workers who were furloughed during the shutdown are expressing cautious relief that the immediate crisis has been resolved, but are also calling for longer-term solutions to prevent future shutdowns, with the American Federation of Government Employees issuing a statement welcoming the continuing resolution while calling on Congress to pass a full-year appropriations bill that would provide stability and certainty for federal workers and the agencies they serve. And union leaders are also calling for reforms to budget processes that would prevent shutdowns from occurring in the first place, suggesting mechanisms such as automatic continuing resolutions that would maintain funding at current levels if Congress fails to pass new appropriations by the start of the fiscal year. Economic analysts are assessing the damage from the shutdown and concluding that while the impact was significant, it was less severe than some had feared given the relatively limited duration of the closure, with preliminary estimates suggesting that the shutdown reduced GDP growth for the quarter by approximately 0.2 percentage points, cost the economy several $billion in lost productivity and delayed economic activity, and created hardship for hundreds of thousands of federal workers and contractors who went without paychecks, though most of this economic activity is expected to be recovered relatively quickly as government operations resume and federal workers receive their back pay and resume normal spending patterns. Moving to our third major story, international reaction to the Trump administration's withdrawal from multiple international organizations and treaties continues to intensify, with allied governments, international institutions, and non-governmental organizations all scrambling to understand the full scope of the withdrawals and to assess their implications for international cooperation on issues ranging from climate change to human rights to arms control. The United Nations Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, held a press conference at UN headquarters in New York this afternoon to address the American withdrawals, expressing what he diplomatically characterized as deep concern about the United States' decision to withdraw from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and potentially other UN bodies, warning that effective international cooperation requires the participation of all major powers, and that American withdrawal from multilateral institutions makes it more difficult to address global challenges that transcend national borders and require coordinated international responses. Though Guterres was careful to avoid directly criticizing the United States and instead emphasized his hope that American policymakers would reconsider these decisions and recognize the value of multilateral cooperation. European Union leaders, meeting in Brussels for a previously scheduled summit, devoted considerable time to discussing the American withdrawals and coordinating a European response, with EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen emerging from the meetings to announce that the European Union remains fully committed to multilateral cooperation and international institutions including the IPCC, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and the broader UN system, and that Europe will work with other like-minded countries to maintain the effectiveness of these institutions regardless of American participation, though von der Leyen also expressed hope that the United States might reconsider its withdrawals and rejoin international efforts to address shared challenges. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who took office just 2 months ago following elections in December, used the Brussels summit to announce that Germany would increase its financial contributions to international climate research and the IPCC to help offset the loss of American funding and expertise, committing an additional €150 million over the next 3 years to support international climate science and assessment activities. And Merz characterized this as an investment in the international cooperation and fact-based policymaking that he described as essential to addressing the climate crisis effectively. French President Emmanuel Macron struck a somewhat more critical tone in his own comments to reporters, suggesting that American withdrawal from climate institutions represents a strategic error that will reduce American influence over international climate policy while doing nothing to protect American economic interests, arguing that the transition to clean energy is inevitable and that countries that resist this transition will find themselves at an economic disadvantage as clean technologies become more cost-effective and as international markets increasingly demand low-carbon products and services. And Macron announced that France would work with the European Union, China, India, and other major economies to maintain momentum on climate action and to ensure that the IPCC and other climate institutions remain effective and well-funded. Climate scientists and researchers who contribute to the IPCC's work are expressing dismay at the American withdrawal, with several prominent American climate scientists issuing an open letter condemning the decision and pledging to continue their participation in IPCC assessments in their individual capacities even without official U.S. government support, though these scientists acknowledge that American withdrawal will make their work more difficult by reducing their access to government data and resources and potentially creating complications with their home institutions if official U.S. policy is opposed to IPCC participation. The broader implications of American withdrawal from multiple international organizations are beginning to come into focus as additional details emerge about the scope of the executive order, with reports indicating that the United States is also withdrawing from or significantly reducing its engagement with several UN human rights mechanisms, certain arms control verification regimes, and potentially some international development organizations, though the administration has not yet released a complete list of affected organizations and appears to be rolling out these announcements gradually, possibly to avoid the appearance of a wholesale abandonment of international cooperation or to maintain flexibility to reverse some decisions if domestic or international pushback becomes too intense.